Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for a focused briefing on the recent storms, status of water supplies, and what it means for drought. California leaders will also be providing updates on storm recovery, federal assistance, and the status of the legislature and governor's investments in drought and flood resilience. We'll be hearing from Secretary of Natural Resources Agency, Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of the Department of Food and Agriculture, Karen Ross, Secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency, Yana Garcia, as well as Director of the Department of Water Resources, Carla Nemeth, Director of Department of Fish and Wildlife, Chuck Bonham, and Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, Joaquin Escobar. My name is Miranda Flores, and I'm the Deputy Secretary for Legislation at the Natural Resources Agency, and will be helping facilitate today. We will have a few minutes to answer any questions after the presentation. Please use the chat function feature, and we will do our best to answer all your questions. If we're not able to get to you today in the chat, I'm going to add my email along with my counterparts at sister agencies. Please feel free to email any of us your questions, and someone will answer you back. With that, I hand this off to Secretary Wade Crowfoot.
Hey, thanks, Miranda, and welcome everybody. We've got about almost 6 staff of our state legislative representatives as well as our congressional delegation. And so what we wanted to do is provide you an update on where things stand after these storms. And as Miranda said, looking ahead, what can we expect in coming weeks? How has this impacted our water supply? How are we capturing as much water as we can, considering that we remain in a drought? And answering your questions. So please, if you have questions, be ready to ask them, or you can use the Q&A function, or if you're more comfortable, asking your question or providing input directly to us, Miranda, Rachel, and Craig, their information is below, and they're the legislative representatives for each of our agencies. I'll just say we're obviously very glad to have this 9 atmospheric river storms behind us. From my perspective, pretty remarkable job by first responders across the state, federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, helping impacted communities really make it through what in many cases were emergencies. Obviously, tragic toll in terms of loss of life and destruction from these storms. We're very glad and thankful that President Biden has declared a major disaster declaration, which frees up FEMA funding for both individual residents that have suffered damages from the storms, as well as small businesses and local governments. So I've asked Miranda to put in the chat a good link or a couple of links that you can use just to provide information to your constituents about where they can find more information on federal funding and federal support as they've encountered damages or incurred damages. This is an active process that our California office, Governor's Office of Emergency Services is coordinating. So obviously one key focus right now is just helping communities recover. We've gotten through the emergency response piece, and now we're helping communities recover. So with that said, I wanted to turn it over to Karen, actually, I think maybe, Karen and then Yana, just to talk a little bit about what you're seeing from each of your agencies as it relates to impacts from the storms and how your folks are helping out.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Wade, and thank you all for joining us today. I join with Wade. This is one I've never thought about in the midst of flood, the real loss of life and the way that we've experienced. And so our hearts go out to all of those families, but the response of this coordinated all of government approach, federal and state and local working together, is also going to be key to successful recovery. In agriculture itself, on the one hand, we're all thrilled to have the moisture, and hopefully everyone's doing their parts to try to capture that wherever they can for groundwater recharge. But this is also the time of the year where there are fewer crops in the ground, and where they are in the ground, especially for leafy greens and winter vegetables and melons, it's in the Imperial Valley. But on the Central Coast, especially in Santa Cruz with a big strawberry production that is there, and Salinas Valley where there's winter vegetables and berries, as well as berries up and down the Central Coast. Those are probably the hardest to hit crops, but it's also the time of year where they're starting to put in some early season vegetable crops. And so the heartbreaking part is especially how many of our smallest of the small farmers, many of them new beginning farmers, have lost seed or transplants that were just put into the ground. I've also, because I happen to be in Monterey County on Friday afternoon, I had a number of farm workers who have gone through the ALBA program to become beginning farmers, and they had pictures of the trees that had fallen on their tractor or on their home. And so we're very mindful of helping them get the assistance they need, which is with a coordinated response and recovery center that is state, local, and federal government in one stop place for everyone. So we were able to direct people there where there'll be language assistance for those where English is not their first language. The same thing's been happening in Merced for over a week to really facilitate the assistance that could be made available. Most of the losses have occurred around fencing, irrigation systems, some building losses, hoop houses because of the winds that came with this. A lot of hoop houses that are used to get a lot of seedlings started also literally blew away. We have a page on our cdfa.ca.gov. It's /flood recovery, which is a connector to all of the USDA programs. We don't have as many programs for flood recovery as we've started to do for drought, but a number of programs are available through USDA, everything at the Farm Services Agency with regard to building low income or zero interest loans, crop insurance and how to connect on crop insurance, including those who don't have crop insurance available, and some of the emergency watershed and forestry programs that will help with some of our natural resource recovery. The one thing I did want to touch on is that early on, people want to know what was the dollar amount of these losses, and it's really hard to calculate those as early as it is. Some of the commodity groups have done some really big estimates. For strawberries in 4 different counties, the Strawberry Commission calculates about 1,800 acres that were impacted with a total estimated damage of $200 million. And just in Monterey County, primarily for those landowners that are adjacent to the Salinas River, it's about 20 to 25,000 acres that were flooded by the Salinas River with a $40 to $50 million impact. There may be some food safety issues that are associated with these floodwaters coming into fields that are planted, and our staff is out working with them now. The last thing I wanted to touch on is that because some processing plants, some packing houses, and many of the farmers did not have work available for the farm workers, and that means less hours for farm workers who now are sitting without wages, some for as many as 2 weeks already. And that is an area of deep concern for all of us of how do we support farm workers in situations like this where we don't have ready-made programs for the loss of wages at this particular time for every one of the farm workers, who many are seasonal or less than year-round full-time employees. So I'll leave it at that, Wade. Thank you very much.
Karen, thank you so much. And the last entry on the chat is actually a link to the page you mentioned from the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Those 3 links I've been perusing them. They're great information on all things related to recovery. Turn it over to Yana Garcia, who leads our California Environmental Protection Agency and obviously critical to a lot of the work of recovery. Yana.
Sure. Hi, thanks, Wade. Hi, all, and thanks for that, Secretary Ross. So at CalEPA, I mean, obviously we are pivoting between living in our new climate reality where we're juggling the realities of drought in addition to the reality of this increased water supply we had from the last 9 storms that we've been experiencing. So what we're calling weather whiplash, if you will. And last week, as Wade mentioned, we transitioned from response to recovery, which means that at CalEPA, we're really looking at cleanup from the debris removal side, as well as from the hazardous waste side. During the immediate response phase, we were embedded within the State Operations Center, which we continue to do now, but we were really focused on hazardous waste permitted facilities and the impacts that floodwaters could have on those facilities. Luckily, we did not see any areas of emergency within those facilities. We do count our blessings there. We were also focused on wastewater treatment facilities and drinking water treatment facilities where we had some issues in the San Francisco Bay Area, which have been addressed to the State Water Board, and then we're still monitoring through our regional board. But we're now looking at debris removal from both the household hazardous waste side, so through the Department of Toxics, who are providing technical assistance to local governments, as well as through CalRecycle. Many of you may be familiar with this process, as it's pretty similar to what we go through with wildfires, and we're waiting for the mission task, of course, from the Office of Emergency Services, but we will likely be mission tasked for both the debris removal side and for household hazardous waste, as well as hazardous waste at the local government level. And I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll transition into some of the stormwater and groundwater recharge issues that I know folks are also interested in as well.
Jana, thank you so much for all the work that your team's doing. I next want to turn to Carla Namath, who of course leads our Department of Water Resources, with a special thank you to Carla's team. You probably know that our flood experts in state government reside at Department of Water Resources. And so their team led a joint state federal flood operations center, which worked in partnership with the state operations center for the better part of this month, working to keep people safe. So Carla, I wanted to turn to you to talk about, what can we expect here in coming weeks as it relates to storms and precipitation, and where does this set of storms lead us with water supply and this whole question of drought?
Thank you, Secretary, and I'll just apologize. I am on the road back to Sacramento from Fresno. So maybe just some overarching comments. One of the sort of fundamental things about, this last weather system that ran through is how suddenly we went between two extremes, extreme drought to, record-breaking rainfall totals, depending on where you were in the state. And we are doing further research to really understand the role in which climate and warming temperatures plays in the suddenness and the severity of that shift. So we really are experiencing, I think what many have at least conceptualized all along, which is much more extreme weather conditions. As the Secretary mentioned, we have 9 atmospheric rivers move through the state, varying levels of intensity, both in terms of wind and rainfall and temperature. We do have an incredible snowpack. On average, across the Sierra, it's 200% of our historic average for this date. In some parts of the state, there is some real variability. The most dense snowpack and significant snowpack is in the central and southern Sierras. It's a little bit lighter further north into the Cascade. Our reservoirs kind of tell a similar story. By and large, we are about at 100% of average and increasing as inflow continues into our reservoirs. But beneath that is a slightly different story. We have a couple of reservoirs that are still below historic average for this day. Oroville, though, itself is at about 109%. So some real variability there. As a general matter, the state is still in a drought emergency, and we're going to be in that drought emergency for a little while still. One of the most fundamental things around drought emergency is how not only does California experience a variable hydrology, but there's true variation in terms of water supply availability. So we're going to be looking at how this year shapes up. It's still early in the season. We are sitting on an enormous snowpack, particularly in the Central Sierra. The department will do its next snow survey February 1st. We do hope to update our allocation for the State Water Project, which is something that the State Water Project does a little bit more frequently than our colleagues in the Central Valley Project, but we do anticipate updating that potentially as soon as later this week. And then it really isn't until February when we start to measure runoff. And of course, that runoff is going to be key in understanding what's going to happen with all this snowpack. We have deployed our aerial snow observation surveys as we put planes up and they, from up behind Shasta all the way down through the Central Sierra, they measure snow water content in 3-meter grid down to about an inch, which is really a stunning piece of technology. But both the results of those surveys, plus starting our runoff calculations in February is going to give us a much better picture as we move through the remainder of the winter and the spring. We are tracking a storm potentially in the beginning of February. It's still too far enough out to really understand it as to whether or not it dissipates or gains in strength and what that will be like. Certainly, if that does make landfall, we want it to be as cold as possible because warm storms on top of significant snowpack create a lot of challenges. Irrespective of that, we are going to be very focused over the course of the next several months from a flood perspective in really understanding how we anticipate the snowmelt to go in the San Joaquin Valley. We still have our flood operations center standing, and that will remain over the course of the next several weeks and months, so that we can make sure as that snow melt, we understand levee conditions and if there's any danger, we're flood fighting and we're making sure we're keeping people safe. So not quite out of the woods yet with drought, but over the course of the next several weeks, we'll get a much clearer sense of the water supply picture for this year. But by and large, where we experience very acute drought is folks who are dependent on groundwater wells. And, that's not going away. Groundwater takes a long time to recharge. So in all likelihood, parts of California, the way you may remember as we entered into the drought, it started regionally and then really spread throughout California. And the governor was very careful about how he declared drought emergencies. And I would say you could probably expect parts of California to emerge from a drought emergency, also just and regionally, not, in one blanket way across the state, owing to just the variability in terms of water supply reliability, depending on where you are. And I think that's probably about it, Secretary, and I'd be happy to answer questions a little later on in our
Thanks so much, Carla. And thanks for being down in Fresno. I know you're working on these issues in real time. If I can, let me just ask one follow-up question, because I know we've been getting questions about the pumping for water supply of the San Joaquin and Sacramento supplies through the Delta. Where are we at with the state pumping, and what's the volume, and where does that stand?
Yeah, sure. So the Central Valley project is moving about 4 cubic feet per second. I mean, they're at capacity with the pumping. The State Water Project is moving significantly more capacity as a pumping plant. And we're moving about 9,600 cubic per second. This regulatory action that we needed to take, that's essentially protecting fish as sediment transport moves into the Delta with our first series of storms. One really important thing
Oh shoot, Carla.
San Joaquin system, those flows are running very, very high. Those flows are running very, very high, and it's actually essentially overwhelming some of the other conditions in the South Delta, and that's what's enabling us to move significant volumes of water. San Luis Reservoir is about at 72% of historic average, which is incredible given where it started and that we've made up just a significant amount of water and put a lot in storage in that key reservoir that helps us determine availability. And we're going to keep moving as much water as we safely can. And then I think, Secretary, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, of course, the triggering of these regulations at exactly this moment when we've been experiencing such high flows in the Delta. Really, the fundamental way to address that is with modernizing infrastructure, and that really speaks to the need for the Delta Tunnel Conveyance Project, one that Governor Newsom has been championing, and as a really important climate mitigation strategy when we get these very extreme events. It's pretty clear that we can't afford, when there's so much water in the system, to be able to really move it and store it. And fundamentally, you know, when we have 150,000 cubic feet per second moving out the Golden Gate, and it just really speaks to, you know, the infrastructure needs that we have as being overwhelmingly important as we move into this more hotter, drier, and climate whiplash scenario.
Carla, thanks so much. And you, there was a time you broke up when you were explaining just the volume of water moving through the pumps. And I think you said we're up to 9,600 cubic feet per second, or CFS, through the pumps at this point.
For the State Water Project, and the Central Valley Project is moving about 4,000 cubic feet per second. And that is the capacity of the Central Valley Project.
Got it. That's really helpful to understand. In a little bit, we're going to hear from Chuck Bonham, who of course leads our Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I'll ask Chuck, in addition to talking about the status or just how the fish and wildlife have been impacted, to talk a little bit about the the balance that we strike on the exporting water from the Delta, and then also the protecting the environment. So let's move back to Secretary Garcia, Yana, and Joaquin Esquivel, who leads our State Water Board. Specifically, they're going to focus in on, what are we doing to capture these flood flows, and how are we supporting local efforts to capture the flood flows for later use?
Sure. Thanks, Secretary Crowfoot. So I'm going to take a bit of time starting with groundwater recharge, and then want to talk a bit about our work around stormwater capture before kicking it over to Chair Esquivel, who's also on the line here with us. So as many of you are aware, capturing these flood flows, as Director Nemeth was also just describing, is obviously a priority for us. And groundwater recharge has actually long been recognized by the state, but most importantly by our community partners, as a key tool in our local water management strategies. And so this has been something that has been going on for some time. Since 2017, the state board has been implementing a streamlined pathway for recharge projects. And since 2020, we've actually provided nearly $1 billion to support projects that will bring a total of 88,000 acre feet per year to the state's water supplies. Now, 5 of these projects are already complete and add 25,000 acre feet per year right now. Now, to put that in context, that's enough water supply for up to 75,000 households annually, which is great. Now, the fact is that the California water supply strategy that was released by the governor in August also recognizes the need for our state agencies to work together to expand our ability to capture even more water. And this interest is going to help us build on this work, which has already been accomplished through our partnership with the Resources Agency, with DWR, with Department of Fish and Wildlife, and other local agencies who are working to streamline permitting as well for groundwater recharge projects. And I also want to acknowledge that our local agency partners and stakeholders on the ground are doing everything possible to take advantage of these high flows and to spearhead recharge projects, as we've heard a bit, and as Joaquin can delve into a little bit more in the coming minutes. And we're encouraging, most importantly, all who are interested in groundwater recharge projects that require permitting, whether via our 180-day temporary permits or via a new 5-year temporary permit, to reach out as early as possible in their process so that we can work together on those permit requirements in advance and provide as much technical assistance and smooth and swift a path as we possibly can. This is critically important right now, as we're still seeing these flows that we can leverage for the future. Now, I do just want to note finally, before moving into some of the stormwater capture work, that the vast majority of recharge actually happens naturally, does not require permitting. And this is the largest share of recharge capacity. And this also involves much of the recharge that many of our pre-1914 water rights holders are able to capitalize on and able to use for future use, and benefiting from some of these flows. So with that, I do want to kick it over to Chair Esquivel briefly before moving into some of the stormwater capture work that we're doing as well.
Thank you, Secretary. And as the Secretary said, there are 2 pots here of groundwater recharge that's going on. There's on agricultural fields and more rural communities, what's known as managed aquifer recharge that's happening sometimes at a little larger scale. Sometimes it's with existing contractors with, say, the Bureau of Reclamation. And so and then importantly, there's also the urban side, which the secretary will get into, but of the work with our ag community in the more rural sector, and importantly with the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, we're trying to continue to understand how we can accelerate the work that we're doing, but also communicate the opportunity and when actually a grower or someone interested in taking water off the system actually needs a permit. There, I want to flag that when it comes to a lot of the floodwater activities that are going on, when a system is in flood stage, and it is for human health and safety purposes, it does not require a permit to take water off. The important differentiation there is if you want to account for it, if you want to pull it out later in the system, then you need to account for it. But that sort of recharge, that real watershed scale recharge that replenishes groundwater systems because of flood activity isn't something that needs to go to the board. Of those, and as the secretary said, neither of the pre-1914s, of those, we have then these post-1914 permits. We've created these 180-day and now 5-year options to be able to quickly permit them. These aren't permanent draws on the system. They allow people to really take flows off during these opportunities and moments. But importantly, they do require a few months of investment and some planning. You need to really identify where the water is going to be going. And importantly, to what use. And how to do accounting. A number of things that I know can often sound bureaucratic and a little exhausting, especially when we're trying to really use it for such beneficial use. But it is important, and it's an important part that we're trying to get people to plan earlier. We know these extremes are coming intra-year now, and I think that Director Namath rather and I have talked about this, and certainly we had lessons learned from last year, when that wet December really provided a few opportunities where if we had a little better planning, we had some applications in place, we could have taken advantage of those. With DWR's help, we're better shepherding and unpacking what are always a unique set of circumstances, regrettably, upon each project. And it's really about what flows and when. I will flag something that we're working on with the Bureau of Reclamation, where under their own water right, they can take flood flows easier and provide it to either their service contractors, which are already existing, or other processes. We're working with them now in real time, now that we've identified an opportunity with them to see if we can take advantage here on even still yet in this water year, in this winter, of some potential storms coming up, or just be prepared, knowing that, again, that's an option too. So across the board, there's been all that streamlining on those temporary permits. We received about 8 this year. 5, I believe, have already been approved. The other 2 are being worked on, and 1 is a longer term permit. So we're shop is open. We're looking to really be processing these, but it takes real willing applicants to work through what are still oftentimes just issues of, again, availability and multiple claims on some of these systems. So we're all looking to do better by the decision making on it all. And if you're hearing anything, by all means, reach out.
Thanks for that, Chair Esquivel. So then quickly just pivoting into one of the strategies that helps us throughout the state, but also specifically in some of our urban communities, is around stormwater capture projects. So I do want to note that 176 million in stormwater projects have already been funded through Prop 1. So what we're really trying to do is expand our capacity to capture stormwater and to also look at ways that we can streamline the permitting requirements for stormwater capture to leverage this type of water flow that we're seeing in urban communities as well, to maximize recharge and to protect underground sources of drinking water primarily, which remains obviously a key priority of ours through the state board. So the state board is looking at their industrial stormwater permit program and specific stormwater storm sewer system permits by the regional boards, where we can actually reduce some of the requirements for permittees that operate a stormwater capture facility in order to be able to increase the amount of flows that we can capture in major storm events such as those that we've seen. So this is something that is a critical priority for the administration, something we put resources toward, but something that the water board is looking looking at both with a careful eye to protecting drinking water sources and the quality of our water, of course, but also ensuring that we're able to better pivot toward maximizing our stormwater capture capacity, particularly in our urban communities. So with that, I'll just kick it over again to Joaquin in case I missed anything, or to our colleague Anna Neymark or Eric Ekdahl from the Water Board.
Thank you, Secretary. Only thing to add is, the exciting thing in Southern California and some of the urban areas are things like Measure W, where there are some local dollars that can really start to connect with, say, the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Clean Water Act, state revolving fund, and importantly, these financial tools that can really start to hopefully see these next generation of projects. It's an exciting time. Glad to be part of the work. And
Got it.
Eric.
Yeah, anything else from the Water Board team? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
No further updates on my part.
All right.
I
Huge
did want
thanks.
to add, sorry,
Yeah,
Wade,
sure.
I did want to add that in the chat, I did put in a press release from the governor's office of how California is storing water.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Miranda.
So let's shift to, we heard some on environmental impacts already, but I want to turn to Chuck Bonham, who leads our Department of Fish and Wildlife. Chuck, how are Fish and Wildlife coping through the intense storms? What are we seeing with our water situation? If you could just touch base on this balance around water supply versus environmental protection, all would be helpful.
I'll end with the balancing part and start with maybe the good news part. Once you move to the public health and safety dynamic, the ecosystem, our fish and wildlife will have a bump from this. So it's kind of a conventional wisdom, not very wise, that, all water to the ocean's wasted. You get a series of uplifts from high flows like this. You'll see a redo of our channel morphology, our river dynamics for the better, the movement of sediment, the transport of gravels. You'll see benefit to our riparian corridors and plants and trees that create those wildlife migration aspects, the cover to keep water cool. We actually have a lot of data for sturgeon and split tail and other native fish species that there's typically a population bump after a wet year. You can see it correspond in the data. You'll get more access to river margin habitat. It's good for wetlands. Wetlands are indeed called wetlands, so you need water on them to get that benefit. And you get countless groundwater recharge uplifts and floodplain. So just to think about floodplain for a minute, and here in Sacramento, think about the Sutter and Yolo bypasses. We see significant expansion of floodplain habitat when the weirs overtop. If you drove over 80 in the last couple of days between Davis and Sacramento, that's not only a flood safety dynamic, it's a replenishment aspect on the floodplain front. So we see recruitment of juvenile salmon up in the bypasses. We see the creation of tens of thousands of acres of floodplain. At peak flows, we would predict somewhere between 60 to 70,000 acres of that kind of recharge, if you will, on the floodplain. So we'll have staff along with EWR staff out at Fremont and Tisdale Weirs. You need to kind of keep an eye on the floodplain as it recedes to make sure fish aren't stranded and kind of help them along. And then on the kind of wildlife refuge front, we also are in the middle of the flood dynamic on our own properties, managing a lot of outdated levees. So that's a dynamic where we participate with local government and Carla's team in the middle of the flood. But right now, the winter rains have pushed the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge Complex up to about nearly 100% flooded. And so Sacramento is about 98% flooded. Calusa is about 96%. And without these rains, we probably would have been around maybe 70% or less wet. Now, water on the complex doesn't always mean more birds because there's a dynamic around food. And of course, we've had a couple of years where we haven't had food, particularly rice, producing that benefit. On our hatcheries, we were able to keep almost all of them running with power, in part because the legislature and the governor have invested in the last two cycles for us to be prepared with backup generators and other facility assets. And then you get into the balancing act. And Carla was mentioning the dynamic. So just to reiterate that, today the state and federal pumps are pumping at a combined rate of about 13,600 CFS, and about 14,000 is max. So for almost a week, the limiting factor has not been the restrictions and rules in the biological space. It's entirely been about the massive amount of water and how much you can pump. And they're maxed out. So the limiting factor is operational ability. But one of the challenges we get in these high wet years is what happens in the Delta. So you can have a couple of things happen, but the one we're managing right now is the water gets really turbid. And there are certain places where if the water gets above a certain threshold on turbidity, with Carla and Reclamation, the federal biological agencies, we work really hard to avoid that turbidity creating a bridge from the central delta straight down to the pumps. You can almost imagine it as a conveyor belt. And if that turbidity bridge takes hold and remains persistent, the challenge is native fish can get transported right down to the pumps way quicker than typical. And that's a concern because we don't want the salvage of fish at the pumps to increase where we risk triggering even more consequential challenges. So we actually have a rule in place called turbidity bridge avoidance. It was in the 2019 federal biological opinions, and the water users and federal agencies asked us to adopt that rule in the state permit. So both regimes are identical, and we're talking about this daily, and we're looking for bounds of flexibility so we can keep the projects moving as much water as possible while limiting that risk that we walk ourselves into more consequential dynamics when we get to the spring. If we can balance it, and given what she just told us about San Luis, I'm really confident with that snowpack. I don't want to jinx it. We're going to be able to thread this needle and get reservoirs back to where we want them. I mean, just take a look at Shasta. It's up like 56 feet in the past 4 weeks. And having Shasta up to, I think it's at 2.36 million acre feet right now, compared to a year ago at this time when it was at 1.55 million acre feet, is going to be great for salmon and really good for the Sac Valley, who had a brutal year last year economically. So that's kind of a big picture. It's pretty common. People come out of the woodworks asking us to pump more or less. We're on it daily. We've got more boats on the water, thanks to the State Water Project contractors. And we're using real-time assessment and trying to find all the flexibility we can to navigate this space.
Chuck, thanks so much. And just to reiterate Carla's point, we're working on a longer term infrastructure, update on that conveyance through the Delta, in part to really work to avoid these environmental impacts while maximizing supply. Hey, question about the Klamath refuges to the far north. They've been in really dire conditions over the last couple of years. How are they doing?
Not as well as the Sacramento right now. So part of water on those systems is more closely related to our relationship with the Bureau of Reclamation. And they're in the middle of managing lake level and river flows. And we have not been able to produce a similar wet up on the Klamath Refuge Complex like it's occurring in the Sacramento. I know it's important, Pablo. I saw your comment. We're working on it. And I think this one's going to require us to talk a little bit more forcefully with the Bureau in the coming days.
Got it. That's really helpful. Yep. So folks tuning in here, now we're up to 80 people. Please do, if you have questions you want us to answer, you can take yourself off mute and ask them in just a little bit, or you could just put them in the chat. So we're rounding out the proactive update here, and want to turn it back to Karen and Yana too. I think one point that's important to make for everybody is that the legislature's investments, the governor's investments that we've been making in drought resilience and flood resilience, are paying off. Despite the drought being really the leading water topic over the last few years, the legislature and governor invested hundreds of millions of dollars in flood protection over the last 4 years. And that's actually drawn down almost 2 times that amount of federal flood protection funding. So we actually have billions of dollars of investment to our levee system, to our flood protection infrastructure over the last few years. If you're based in Sacramento and you know where the American River is in Sac State, you've probably seen a lot of that work in progress, where we helped to fund an Army Corps of Engineers project to strengthen the American River levee to protect Sacramento. Likewise, with our drought investments that the legislature and the governor championed, we continue to get that funding out the door. And so, turning it to Karen and Yana for any highlights of that. But it just, please know that the leadership that you all have provided, both at the state level, but also at the congressional level, has been huge. And we're making those investments even as we're dealing with this stuff in real time. Let me turn it to Karen.
Yeah, so I'm just going to touch on, this is all about building resiliency, whether it's extreme heat, drought, or floods. And so at the Department of Food and Agriculture, we've made significant investments ever since 2014 in on-farm water use efficiency. The technologies are continually changing to help us improve the way we use water on farms as precisely as we possibly can. We've invested over $200 million in the last almost 10 years now, including $50 million in grants that were issued right towards the end of 2022. And that's been an important program for us to be prepared for the hotter, drier future, that we're really using every drop as efficiently as we possibly can. And with that, we're also improving and avoiding erosion of soils, as well as improved nitrogen efficiency and using less fertilizer. The other one I want to call to your attention may not be as obvious as the investment that we have started to make over the last 4 years in healthy soils. This is about really building up carbon in our soils, that soil organic matter, so that we're improving the water holding capacity to be able to withstand higher temperatures, really encouraging and providing incentive grants for cover crops, which also prevent erosion unless there's really fast moving water coming through those fields. It makes a huge improvement in sediment and erosion coming off of our soils. And so I just wanted to call out those very specific on-farm programs that we've been able to invest in addition to the technical assistance to improve every farmer's ability to be really building up as much resilience as possible for this rapidly changing climate that we're trying to farm and grow food in. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Yana?
Yeah, just really quickly, thanks again all for your interest here and for the opportunity to talk to you about this. I want to just take a moment. I know I mentioned the $176 million for stormwater projects already funded under Prop 1, but I also just want to take a moment to flag an investment in our proposed January budget and the governor's proposed January budget that includes a really important proposal for resources to help us continue to expedite new water production and storage through planning and permitting of these stormwater capture projects that we described that are so critical, particularly to our urban areas. And this is $13.5 million over 3 years. It's really something that shows our commitment to continue this work and that we hope that we can see all the way through as we're expecting more of these winter storms in addition to drought, and want to Secretary Ross's point, really make sure that we're putting that money toward our resilience capacity in all of the diverse regions of our state. So just wanted to make that point as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Yana. Carla, if you're still on and in range for us, there's a question coming in. Updates regarding infrastructure repairs to conveyance systems and projects that have suffered from subsidence, including Bryant Kern Canal and Delta Mendota Canal. I think go for it.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because that's another issue that I think we're going to experience this year. So right now, the Bryant Kern Canal is, under construction, and I've been told that the contractors are going to get out of there in the next 2 days, which will enable that facility to move water, which is going to be critical. The state has an additional round of funding to support that project. And then both the California Aqueduct, which is part of the State Water Project, and the Delta Mendota Canal also have subsidence problems. And this is the kind of year when they are expressed the most, because the subsidence starts to really affect our ability to deliver water in these high water years. So estimates between 10 and 20% reduction in capacity just given the effects of subsidence over time. I know there's federal dollars that are supporting the federal canal. And I think that, one of our just kind of overall conundrums is the requirements for other matches to unlock state funding. And so we're going to be working with our state water contractor partners to make sure that we can do that, and working with our congressional delegation to sort through the way in which we can bring federal dollars to bear on our remaining 2 large canal systems. Secretary, if you don't mind, I was remiss in not mentioning the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan that was adopted by our flood board in mid-December of this year. We have a lot of information on that on our website, including an executive summary, but it focuses on the state plan of flood control, which is the Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. Traditionally, the San Joaquin Valley has been underinvested. We have work to do with our partners, the Army Corps of Engineers, to conduct some feasibility studies that enable us to make those investments. And so that's very squarely on our radar. We know with climate, that area continues to be extremely vulnerable to significant flooding. We have expended all of Prop 1E, which was state dollars. As the secretary mentioned, the governor has continued to put money towards really crucial flood improvements. In addition to the American River improvements, the governor also put about $360 million to flood projects to help protect the city of Stockton, which is probably the biggest, most flood-prone city in California. So we're very focused on that, and this is further conversation, jointly, that can enable us to identify the next generation of flood improvements that need to be made, and appropriate funding sources for that. Thank you.
Huge thanks, Carla. Jan, a question for you about the Tijuana River Valley. Are there additional resources needed to support the recovery in that area, either state or federal resources?
Yeah, I'm seeing that here now. So, as Secretary Ross, I think, mentioned at the outset, we have a lot of interest in the totals, both at the local and then regional level and statewide level, and what the damage is that's been caused. To my knowledge, we don't have a working figure for what's going on in San Diego. Our local government partners would probably be best positioned to answer that right now. But I will say that the Tijuana River issues are always there, unfortunately. And I think we've seen in these rain events, but even more so in other rain events that didn't quite get the same level of attention that this one did, ongoing issues with the pollution crisis at the Tijuana River. The federal solution that, as many of you know, of course, US EPA is working on implementing, does have a delta. I believe the last I checked, it was about 40 million. We are, as always, really committed to looking at how we can put resources toward that ourselves, but also really want to talk to you all more. And this could be the topic of maybe an ongoing offline conversation about how to strategize in this next phase moving forward with the Tijuana River, with the down payment that we have on the solution at the IBWC, but also moving forward to see how we can fill in the gaps most strategically with our colleagues on the Mexican side as well. So welcome a follow-up conversation on that. But that is the perennial ongoing issue relating to these storms, but also beyond the storms as well.
Thanks so much. So we've had at least some people join about partway through. So as we're waiting for any final direct questions to us, I might just recap sort of key takeaways for those that are joining a bit late. First of all, we talked about recovery and included in the chat are key resources to help your constituents understand where there may be federal funding to help with their recovery efforts. Karen talked about the work that our California Department of Food and Agriculture is doing with farmers who have been impacted to really communicate the costs of those impacts. Yana Secretary Garcia from CalEPA on the work they're going to be doing most likely once tasked with debris removal and household toxics. We heard from Director Namath from DWR, the weather report. So we're tracking a storm potentially 2 weeks out. That's good news because we know we've got a lot of the wet season remaining in front of us, and it's too early to really fully conclude what this set of recent storms means for our water supply and therefore drought. So let's keep our fingers crossed for continued precipitation and cold precipitation or cold weather storms, but more to come in coming weeks. That being said, we're really encouraged by reservoirs ticking up significantly. Some of the large ones, both north and south of the Delta. Pumping is now really at its limit in terms of the physical configuration of the pump. So not at this point being restricted by protections because of the conditions we're experiencing. So good news there, both for the environment and for our water supply. And both Carla and Chuck Bonham, who leads our Department of Fish and Wildlife, summarize just that balance that we're seeking and we achieve to protect both the environment and the Delta, and then maximize the pumping for water supply. And really highlighting we're focused on an infrastructure fix, and that is the Delta conveyance to actually protect the environment and maximize water supply in these big bursts of rain. And then huge thanks, Yana and Joaquin, for running us through all that's happening on groundwater recharge and stormwater capture. And please let us know if you're getting questions or concerns from local stakeholders about that. And then we got some good news from Chuck, who leads our Fish and Wildlife, about what the storm means for fish and wildlife. Good news there. But of course, we continue to be facing a water shortage and the drought writ large over 3 years. So more to come on that moving forward. Yana, Karen, other sort of key takeaways you'd add before we end here?
Great wrap up, Wade.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was a good summary. I do just someone on my team just flagged for me on that last point for the Tijuana River that the water board did just recently approve $34 million for projects on the border that we intend to go toward the Tijuana River as well. So wanted to put that out there for what that's worth on that last point. And thanks so much, Secretary Crowfoot, for the great recap and for holding us to a good agenda here. Thanks, you all.
Thank you. I'll lastly just say in the chat is follow-up information for each of our deputy secretaries for legislation at CalEPA, CDFA, and resources. And so just you can take those down before you leave. That would be Rachel from CDFA, Craig from CalEPA, and Miranda from resources. Miranda, over to you for the last word.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. And yes, as Wade mentioned, please take down our information and continue to keep in contact with us with any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Oh, thanks.